You already know something is off. You just keep explaining it away. Not the big things. The big things have names, have reasons, have people you can blame, or circumstances you can point to. The thing that's harder to explain is smaller than that. It's the decision you made last week that felt completely rational. And now, 4 days later, you can see exactly what you were actually doing. It's the conversation you replayed for 2 hours that the other person forgot about by dinner. It's the version of a situation your brain handed you. Confident, detailed, fully sourced. That turned out to be mostly fiction. You didn't notice it being constructed. That's the part nobody talks about. The brain doesn't feel like it's interpreting. It feels like it's reporting. You don't experience yourself receiving a story about what just happened. You experience what just happened. The gap between those two things is where most of the damage gets done. Not in crises. Not in moments of obvious irrationality. In the ordinary Tuesday, when your brain assembled a version of reality in under a second, and you spent the rest of the day living inside it without once questioning the source. I know a version of this from the inside. A period where I was making decisions I would have described, in real time, as careful and considered. I had reasons. I had logic. I was, by my own accounting, being thoughtful. It took about 18 months and one conversation I wasn't prepared for to understand that I'd been thoughtful about the wrong question the entire time. The reasoning was sound. The premise it was built on I had never examined. Not once. That's not a story about being foolish. That's a story about how this works. Your brain is not broken. It's not underdeveloped or under-resourced or in need of an upgrade. It is doing, with remarkable efficiency, exactly what it was designed to do. Generate fast, confident meaning from incomplete information. Protect you from threat. Keep the story coherent. It has been doing this successfully your entire life. The problem isn't the machinery. The problem is that the machinery was calibrated for a world that no longer exists, running threat detection software on situations that aren't threats, generating certainty in conditions that don't support it, and presenting all of this to you as perception rather than interpretation. You can't turn it off. You wouldn't want to. The same system that misleads you also keeps you functional, social, and alive. What you can do is learn to see it operating, to catch the story being assembled before you've fully committed to living in it, to recognize the moment your brain moves from data to conclusion and ask, briefly, whether the move was warranted. That gap between what happened and what your brain decided it meant is where this entire book lives. Not in frameworks, not in habits you'll maintain for 11 days. In that fraction of a second that's available in every conversation, every decision, every moment where the brain is about to hand you a version of reality and call it the truth. This book will not fix your thinking. Nothing fixes thinking. Thinking isn't broken. It's just faster than it is accurate. What this book will do is make the machinery visible. And visible machinery, even complicated machinery, is machinery you can work with. That's the whole offer. It's less exciting than transformation. It's considerably more useful. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The Cluttered Desk Problem. A man in Ohio keeps a sticky note on his monitor that says "Call dentist." It has been there for 11 months. He sees it every morning. He has never called the dentist. The note is no longer a reminder. It's furniture. That's mental clutter. Not chaos, not crisis. Just the steady accumulation of things you've decided not to decide about yet. Here's what the productivity books get wrong about mental clutter. They treat it like disorganization, like the solution is a better system, a cleaner inbox, a color-coded planner. But clutter isn't a filing problem, it's a decision problem. Every piece of mental noise sitting in your head right now is there because you haven't made a call about it. Not because you forgot, because some part of you is still negotiating. The unread email you're avoiding, the conversation you keep meaning to have, the goal you announced to 3 people and haven't touched since. None of these are taking up space because your memory is full. They're taking up space because they're unresolved. Your brain keeps them active, flagged, running in the background, because that's what brains do with open loops. They don't close them for you. They just keep pinging. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik effect. Your brain holds unfinished tasks in a kind of active memory, a low hum of incompletion that runs continuously beneath your conscious thought. It was first observed in the 1920s when a researcher noticed that waiters could remember every detail of an unpaid order and forgot it entirely the moment the bill was settled. Completion releases the hold. Incompletion sustains it. This means the cognitive weight you're carrying right now is almost entirely made of things you haven't finished or decided. Not things that are actually hard, things that are just open. I once kept a home repair on my mental list for so long that by the time I dealt with it, the original problem had caused 2 additional problems. The delay didn't protect me from deciding. It just made the decision more expensive. The fix is not organization. The fix is resolution. You have to actually close the loops, not manage them. Here's how that works in practice. You sit down with a piece of paper and you write down everything that's open. Not your to-do list. Everything. The thing with your brother you haven't addressed. The financial decision you've been circling. The creative project that exists only as a vague sense of guilt. You write it down and then, and this is the part people skip, you make a decision about each one. Not necessarily a solution, a decision. You either act on it, schedule it, consciously defer it, or you let it go. Those are the only 4 options. Anything else is just leaving the sticky note on the monitor. The moment you make a decision about something, even the decision to stop thinking about it, your brain releases it. The hum quiets. This is not motivational language. This is the actual mechanics of how your prefrontal cortex manages working memory. Resolution is the mechanism. Intention is not enough. What you'll notice, after running this process honestly, is that most of your mental clutter isn't important. It persisted not because it mattered, but because you never told your brain it was allowed to stop. You left every tab open and then wondered why the whole system was running slow. There's also a subtler layer here. Some clutter is emotional, not logistical. The thought you keep returning to about a decision you made 3 years ago. The conversation that replays. These don't resolve through action. They resolve through acknowledgement. You have to look at them directly, name what they cost you, and then consciously choose to stop relitigating. Your brain will resist this. It believes, incorrectly, that continued review might eventually change the outcome. It will not. A clear mind is not an empty mind. It's a mind where everything that's present has been put there on purpose, where the background noise has been addressed, resolved, or deliberately set aside. That's a different cognitive environment than most people ever experience. Not because it's difficult to create, because it requires making decisions you've been quietly hoping to avoid. The sticky note on the monitor isn't a reminder. It's an avoidance strategy with a font. Deal with it. Your brain has been waiting. Chapter 2. The gap between stimulus and story. A woman gets a one-line email from her manager. Can we talk tomorrow? No context, no subject, just that. She spends the next 4 hours constructing an elaborate internal narrative about what it means. Her performance, the restructuring rumors, that comment she made in the meeting 2 weeks ago. She barely sleeps. She shows up the next morning prepared for the worst. Her manager wants to discuss a new project, one she's being considered for, a good thing. The email didn't cause 4 hours of suffering. The story she built around the email did. This is the gap. The space between what actually happened and what your brain decided it meant. It exists in every human mind, fires dozens of times a day, and operates almost entirely below conscious awareness. You don't experience the gap. You experience the story. And by the time you notice it, it already feels like reality. Cognitive behavioral psychology has been pointing at this for decades. The event is never the problem. The interpretation is the problem. Not because your interpretations are stupid or irrational, but because they're fast. Your brain generates meaning at a speed that prioritizes confidence over accuracy. It would rather give you a wrong answer immediately than a right answer slowly. Speed kept your ancestors alive. Speed is also why you spent last Tuesday convinced a neutral text message was passive-aggressive. The brain fills gaps with threat. That's the default. When information is incomplete, which it almost always is, your nervous system doesn't wait patiently for more data. It assumes danger and reverse engineers a story to justify the assumption. This is not pessimism. This is ancient threat detection running on modern hardware. The system cannot tell the difference between a predator in tall grass and an ambiguous Slack notification. I've watched someone I know reconstruct an entire friendship around a single unreturned call. The friend had been in the hospital. He didn't know that. He'd already written the eulogy for the relationship by the time she called back. Here's what makes this particularly difficult. The story your brain generates feels like perception. It doesn't feel like interpretation. You don't think I am currently constructing a narrative about what this means. You think I can see what's happening here. The certainty is built into the mechanism. The brain doesn't say this might mean trouble. It says this is trouble. First person. Present tense. No asterisk. Working with this gap requires a specific skill. Not optimism, not positive thinking, not reframing everything as good. It requires the ability to notice when you've moved from data to story. To catch yourself mid-construction and ask, what do I actually know here? Versus what have I assumed? This sounds simple. It is not simple. The gap closes in under a second. By the time you're aware of the story, you've already been living in it for a few minutes. The practice is catching it earlier and earlier, not preventing it, but intercepting it before it fully hardens into conviction. One useful tool is what some researchers call cognitive distancing, creating just enough separation between yourself and the thought to examine it. Not this is a disaster, but I'm having the thought that this is a disaster. The rewording sounds minor. The effect is not. Labeling the thought as a thought, rather than experiencing it as reality, activates the prefrontal cortex and slightly loosens the grip. It doesn't fix the story. It creates enough space to question it. Another tool is deliberate ambiguity tolerance. Most people treat uncertainty as something to resolve as quickly as possible. The faster you close the gap, the more likely you are to close it wrong. Sitting with, "I don't know what this means," yet feels uncomfortable in a way that feels almost physical. That discomfort is your brain lobbying hard for a conclusion. Any conclusion. Learning to hold the pause, to let the information stay incomplete a little longer, is one of the most cognitively difficult things a person can do. It is also one of the most protective. The gap between stimulus and story is where your emotional life is being scripted in real time. You are the writer. You just rarely show up to the page consciously. Most people let the brain draft the whole thing alone. Then they wonder why they keep reading the same story. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3, Thinking in Sprints, Not Marathons. A man sits down on a Sunday afternoon to finally figure out his career. He has a blank notebook, a fresh coffee, and 3 hours. He stares at the page for 40 minutes, writes things I'm good at the top, lists 4 items, crosses out 2, closes the notebook, and watches television for the rest of the evening. Monday arrives. Nothing has changed. He tells himself he needs more time to think. He does not need more time to think. He needs a smaller question. This is the central problem with how people approach large decisions. They treat them as single events. Sit down, think hard, arrive at answer, when in reality, every large decision is a sequence of smaller ones, each of which depends on the one before it. Trying to answer the whole thing at once is not ambitious. It's structurally impossible. It's like trying to read a book by staring at all the pages simultaneously. The brain doesn't work in marathons. It works in sprints. Short, focused bursts of directed attention, followed by rest, followed by integration. This is not a metaphor. This is how cognition actually functions. Sustained, unbroken focus on a complex problem doesn't produce clarity. It produces a specific kind of fatigue that feels like thinking, but is mostly just repetition. You revisit the same 3 considerations in a slightly different order and call it deliberation. Decision sprints work differently. You identify the smallest next question, not the whole problem, just the next thing you actually need to know, and you pursue only that. You gather just enough information to answer it. Then you stop. You let the brain process. Then you identify the next question. The key word is enough. Not complete. Not perfect. Enough to move forward one step. Most people, when researching a decision, are unconsciously trying to achieve certainty before they act. They keep gathering information because somewhere in the back of their mind, they believe that sufficient research will eventually eliminate risk. It won't. Risk is not a product of insufficient information. It's a feature of the future. More data rarely removes it. It mostly just delays the moment you have to decide. There's a term in psychology, analysis paralysis, that gets thrown around casually. But the mechanism underneath it is worth examining. When the brain is overloaded with information, it doesn't synthesize better. It freezes. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for weighing options and projecting outcomes, becomes less effective under cognitive load, not more. The feeling of needing more information before deciding is often the brain already overwhelmed, asking for relief disguised as thoroughness. I spent 6 weeks researching a decision that required, in retrospect, about 4 days of actual thinking. The extra 5 weeks produced one useful insight and a comprehensive understanding of options I was never going to choose. The sprint model has a structure. First, define the core question. Not the whole problem, just what you need to answer right now. Second, gather targeted information with a time limit attached. Third, make a provisional decision, not final, not permanent, just the best call with what you currently have. Fourth, act on it in the smallest possible way. Fifth, observe what actually happens and feed that back into the next sprint. That last step is what most frameworks miss. The action itself is data. You don't learn what you need to know by thinking harder. You learn it by doing something small and watching what it tells you. A week of running a side project teaches you more about whether you want to run a business than 6 months of thinking about running a business. Reality has information that your imagination simply doesn't have access to. Deadlines matter here, not as pressure, but as structure. An open-ended question is a question your brain will never fully engage with, because the brain allocates attention based on urgency. Without a boundary, the decision lives permanently in the background, important but not pressing, always deferred in favor of whatever is immediate. A self-imposed deadline converts it from background noise into foreground problem. The brain engages differently. It has to. There's also something psychologically important about momentum. A decision in motion generates information. A decision held perfectly still generates anxiety. Each small step, even an imperfect one, produces real feedback, builds confidence, and reduces the subjective size of the overall problem. The mountain doesn't get smaller, but you get higher, which changes what you can see. The man with the blank notebook didn't fail to plan his career because he wasn't smart enough, or brave enough, or ready enough. He failed because he asked a question so large it had no entry point. The notebook stayed blank because there was nowhere to begin. Give yourself a smaller question, a real deadline. 30 minutes. You'll be surprised what becomes possible when you stop trying to finish the race before you found the starting line. Chapter 4. Rewiring is real but slow. A woman buys a journal on January 2nd. By January 14th, it contains 6 entries, 3 of which are apologies to the journal for not writing more. By February, it's under the bed. By March, she has bought a different journal because this one carries the energy of failure. This is not a self-discipline problem. This is a misunderstanding of how brains actually change. Neuroplasticity is real. The brain genuinely does form new connections in response to repeated experience. Neural pathways that get used strengthen. Ones that don't get used weaken. This is not self-help language borrowed from neuroscience. It is neuroscience. The brain is physically altered by what you repeatedly do and think. That part is true. What's also true is that it's slow. Significantly slower than any book will make it sound. The same research that confirms neuroplasticity also confirms that meaningful structural change in the brain requires consistent repetition over weeks and months, not days. The inspiring before and after framing, old brain, new brain, transformation, is real in principle and misleading in timeline. People read about rewiring and expect renovation. What they get, if they're consistent, is something closer to paint drying. Correct direction, invisible progress, easy to abandon. This matters because most people give up on new mental habits, not because the habits don't work, but because the feedback loop is too slow to feel real. You meditate for 2 weeks and you don't feel calmer. You feel like someone who has been sitting still for 2 weeks. The brain has changed slightly. You cannot detect it. You conclude it isn't working. The irony is that this exact conclusion, "It isn't working, I should stop," is itself a product of the old neural patterns you were trying to change. The brain that resists new habits and the brain that evaluates whether new habits are working are the same brain. It is not a neutral observer. Here's what the research actually shows about how change happens. First, it requires repetition that is consistent enough to be boring. Not intense, not inspired, boring. The brain doesn't respond to motivation. Motivation fluctuates too much. It responds to regularity. A small habit done daily for 3 months outperforms a large habit done enthusiastically for 2 weeks, followed by nothing. The biology doesn't care how committed you felt on the first day. Second, the early phase of building a new mental pattern feels worse before it feels better. When you begin questioning automatic thoughts, for example, you don't immediately feel clearer. You feel more aware of how often your brain misleads you, which is temporarily uncomfortable. This is progress. It feels like deterioration. Many people stop here. Third, and this is the part that genuinely surprised me when I understood it, you don't replace old neural patterns. You build new ones alongside them. The old pathway doesn't disappear. It weakens from disuse while the new one strengthens. This means that under stress, under sleep deprivation, under pressure, the old pattern will often reassert itself. Not because you've failed, because the old road is still there, just less traveled. Relapse into old thinking is not evidence that change hasn't happened. It's evidence that you're human, and it's Tuesday. The practical implications of this are significant. If change is slow and invisible and temporarily uncomfortable, the only viable strategy is to make the practice small enough to be sustainable and consistent enough to actually accumulate. Not a dramatic overhaul, a tiny repeated action that your brain can execute even on bad days. The journal that requires 6 minutes, not an hour. The reflection that happens at the same time every day, not when you feel inspired. Inspiration is the wrong fuel for rewiring. It burns hot and fast and leaves nothing. Routine is the right fuel. Boring, unsexy, reliably combustible routine. The woman who bought the second journal was not lacking commitment. She was lacking a realistic model of how long this takes and what it feels like while it's working. She expected to feel different. She felt the same, which felt like failure, which confirmed the neural pattern she was trying to change. The brain changes. It just doesn't send progress reports. Trust the repetition. Distrust the timeline you had in mind. Chapter 5. Emotions are data with a PR problem. A man is in a meeting. His idea gets passed over without comment. Not rejected, just skipped, like it wasn't said. He feels something move through his chest. Hot. Quick. He spends the next 40 minutes not listening to the meeting, composing responses in his head to a slight that no one else in the room registered as significant. He goes home irritable. His partner asks how his day was. He says fine. The emotion was real. The story he built around it expanded 3 times beyond what the moment contained. Both things are true simultaneously. This is the central confusion people have about emotions and decision-making. They treat emotions as either gospel or interference. Either you follow the feeling completely, or you override it entirely. Both approaches fail. The feeling contains real information. The feeling also arrives without context, without proportion, and occasionally without any relationship to what's actually happening. Emotions are data. They are not accurate data. They are not irrelevant data. They are fast, compressed, often mislabeled signals from a system that has been running threat detection and social monitoring for your entire life. They know things your conscious mind doesn't. They also catastrophize, misattribute, and hold grudges with a dedication that would be impressive if it weren't so exhausting. The science of affect labeling is useful here. Studies in affective neuroscience, particularly work involving the prefrontal cortex and amygdala, show that naming an emotion reduces its intensity, not eliminates. Reduces. When you move a feeling from raw experience into language, you engage the brain's regulatory systems. The amygdala, which is essentially your threat detection alarm, quiets slightly when the prefrontal cortex becomes involved. Naming the emotion is not the same as explaining it away. It's a shift in processing, from being inside the wave to standing at the edge of it. The mistake most people make is skipping this step entirely. They either act from the emotion immediately, or they suppress it and act from the suppression, which is just the emotion in disguise, wearing a reasonable expression. Neither approach uses the data. Both approaches are driven by it. I've made decisions under anger that I framed, in real time, as logic. I constructed reasoning. I cited evidence. I was confident. I was also solving a completely different problem than the one in front of me. The problem being that I was angry. Not that the situation required the action I was taking. The anger was real data about something. It was not a reliable guide to what that something actually was. Reading emotions accurately requires a specific kind of patience most people don't practice. When a feeling arrives, the useful question is not, "What should I do about this?" That question arrives too fast, before you've identified what the signal actually is. The more useful question is, what is this telling me, and is that interpretation accurate? Fear often signals threat, but it also signals novelty, importance, and proximity to something you care about. Anxiety often signals genuine danger. It also signals that you haven't slept enough, that you're underprepared, that you're about to grow. The signal is real. The label your brain applies to it is frequently wrong. There's a specific pattern worth watching for. What psychologists sometimes call emotional misattribution. You feel something intensely, and your brain, rather than sitting with ambiguity, immediately assigns a cause. The cause it assigns is almost always the most salient thing in your environment, not necessarily the actual source. You're anxious about a medical appointment, and you decide you're irritated with your partner. You're grieving something old, and you decide you're furious about something new. The feeling is genuine. The address it gets delivered to is wrong. This is why major decisions made in the immediate aftermath of strong emotion are so frequently regretted. Not because emotions shouldn't inform decisions. They should. But because the emotion needs time to be correctly identified before it can be correctly used. The anger might be important information about a boundary being crossed, or it might be leftover stress from 2 days ago finding the nearest available target. You cannot tell the difference in the first 3 minutes. The practice is simple and genuinely difficult. When a strong emotion arrives, you pause long enough to name it specifically. Not just "I feel bad," but "I feel humiliated," or "I feel afraid," or "I feel invisible." Then you ask what that emotion is actually responding to. Then, and only then, you consider what, if anything, to do. This sequence takes longer than reacting. It produces decisions that don't require apologizing for later. Emotions aren't the enemy of clear thinking. They're part of it. The ones you ignore don't disappear. They just start making decisions without your supervision. Chapter 6. Design the environment before you need willpower. A researcher at a university in the 1990s ran a study on hospital cafeterias. She didn't change the food. She didn't run nutrition campaigns. She didn't ask anyone to make better choices. She moved the water to eye level and put the soda at the back of the refrigerator. Water consumption went up significantly. Soda went down. Nobody felt like they were making a different decision. They just were. This is the most underrated insight in all of behavioral psychology. The environment shapes behavior more reliably than intention does. Not sometimes. Systematically. Consistently. At a scale that should make everyone who has ever blamed themselves for a lack of willpower feel at least slightly vindicated. Willpower is real. It's also finite, depleting, and wildly overestimated as a tool for sustained behavior change. The research on ego depletion, the finding that self-control draws on a limited resource that diminishes with use, has had its complications in replication. But the core observation holds in everyday experience. You make dozens of small, self-regulatory decisions throughout the day. By evening, the ones that require the most effort feel harder than they did in the morning. This is not weakness. This is how the system works. The people who appear most disciplined are rarely running on superior willpower. They've arranged their lives so that the right behavior is the path of least resistance. The person who never eats junk food doesn't have more self-control than you. They have an apartment with no junk food in it. The person who exercises every morning isn't more motivated. They sleep in their workout clothes and put their shoes by the door. The decision was made at environment design time, not at 6 in the morning when it counts. I kept my phone on my desk for 2 years while trying to write. I was deeply committed to the work. I was also deeply distractible. Every time I moved the phone to another room, output doubled. Not because I became more disciplined, because I removed the decision entirely. Discipline wasn't the variable, distance was. This applies directly to clear thinking and decision-making. Cognitive clarity is not evenly distributed across your day. It peaks, typically, in the first few hours after waking, before decision fatigue accumulates, before the social demands of the day start generating emotional noise, before your attention has been fragmented by 17 unrelated inputs. Most people spend this window on email. They're essentially using their sharpest hours to process other people's agendas. Designing your environment for clear thinking means identifying when your mind is at its best and protecting that time structurally. Not through motivation, but through friction. Make it harder to access distraction during peak hours. Make it easier to access focused work. The goal is to remove the moment of decision. If you have to actively choose to focus every morning, focus will lose on a significant percentage of mornings. If you've arranged things so that focus is simply what happens next, the choice disappears. Physical space has a measurable effect on cognitive state. This sounds like interior design advice, and it is also neuroscience. Visual clutter increases cognitive load. A disorganized workspace doesn't just feel distracting. It actively consumes processing capacity that would otherwise be available for thinking. The brain cannot fully ignore its environment. It is always, at some level, modeling and responding to the space it occupies. A clean, organized environment isn't an aesthetic preference. It's a cognitive resource. The same principle applies to information environments. What you consume news, social media, conversations, is not neutral input that passes through you without effect. It shapes the cognitive material available for your thinking. A mind that has spent an hour in high conflict, emotionally charged content does not return to baseline the moment the screen goes dark. It carries that activation into the next decision. Designing your information environment means being selective about what gets in, not because ignorance is virtuous, but because attention is the medium your thinking happens in. Pollute the medium and the thinking degrades. Your social environment is also a design choice. The people you spend the most time with influence not just your mood, but your cognitive habits. The way you frame problems, the options you consider normal, the standards you apply to your own thinking. This is not an argument for ruthless social curation. It's an observation that proximity shapes cognition, whether you intend it to or not. You think like the people you're around. This is either working for you or against you. The deeper principle underneath all of this is that humans are not nearly as autonomous as they believe. The experience of making free choices in the moment is largely an experience of executing the choices that were built into the environment beforehand. You're not deciding in real time as often as you think you are. You're following the path that was laid out, by you, by others, by defaults you never examined. The question is simply whether you laid the path on purpose. Most people didn't. They accepted the defaults, blamed themselves for the outcomes, and tried harder next time with the same environment. Move the water to eye level. Put the soda at the back. Watch what happens without trying. Chapter 7. The Values Audit You've Been Avoiding. A woman in her late 30s sits across from a therapist and says, unprompted, that her most important values are family, creativity, and freedom. She says it with the confidence of someone reciting a fact. The therapist asks her to describe a typical Tuesday. She works 10 hours. She hasn't painted in 8 months. She hasn't taken a vacation in 2 years. She sees her children for approximately 40 minutes of non-logistical interaction per day. The therapist doesn't say anything. He doesn't need to. Most people can tell you their values in under 30 seconds. Almost none of them have checked recently whether those values have anything to do with how they actually live. The values are real, genuinely held, sincerely meant. They were just never operationalized. They exist as identity statements rather than decision filters. They describe the person someone intends to be, which is a completely different thing from the person their Tuesday reveals them to be. This gap between stated values and lived behavior is not hypocrisy in the moral sense. It's a structural problem. Values that aren't translated into specific concrete decisions don't govern behavior. They decorate it. They show up in how people describe themselves at dinner parties. They don't show up in what people actually choose when choice is required. The values audit is uncomfortable for a specific reason. It requires looking at your actual behavior, not your intentions, not your self-concept, not the version of yourself you'd like to be evaluated on, and asking what values that behavior reveals. Not what you believe. What your choices consistently over time demonstrate that you believe. These are frequently different lists. I once believed, genuinely, that I valued depth over speed. I valued taking time with things, doing them properly, not rushing. I then looked at how I actually spent my time and found a pattern of starting things quickly, losing interest at the point where they required sustained effort, and moving to the next thing. What I valued, behaviorally, was novelty. Depth was an aspiration I'd confused for an identity. The audit process has 2 steps. First, You identify your stated values, the ones you'd write down if someone asked, the ones you feel genuinely attached to. Second, you look at your last 30 days of actual behavior and ask what values are evidenced there. Where did your time actually go? What did you choose when choosing was hard? What did you protect when everything was pressing for your attention? The second list is your operational values. The distance between the two lists is where you're suffering without fully understanding why. When behavior and stated values conflict chronically, the psychological result is not neutral. It produces a specific kind of low-grade distress, a sense of misalignment that's hard to name because it doesn't feel like a crisis. Nothing is dramatically wrong. Everything is slightly off. People often mistake this for general dissatisfaction or burnout or the ambient difficulty of adult life. Sometimes it's those things. Often it's simpler. They keep making choices that don't reflect what they actually care about, and the accumulation of that has weight. The clarity that comes from values alignment is not emotional. That's a common misconception, that living by your values will feel good, feel right, feel meaningful in a warm and immediate way. Sometimes it does. More often, it just feels like less friction. Decisions become faster because the filter is clearer. You don't have to deliberate as long when you know what you're actually optimizing for. The agonizing over options dissolves, not because the choices are easier, but because you know which question you're answering. There's also a practical issue with values that are too abstract. Freedom, integrity, growth. These are words that can justify almost any decision. They're broad enough to be useless as filters. Useful values need to be specific enough that they actually exclude options. If your value of family doesn't tell you anything about whether to take a job that requires 60 hours a week and constant travel, it isn't functioning as a value. It's functioning as a feeling you have about family. There's a difference. Concrete values produce concrete guidance. Not I value health, but I make choices that protect my physical capacity to do everything else I care about. Not I value creativity, but I protect time for original work even when productivity would be easier. The more specific the value, the more decisional work it can actually do. The woman in the therapist's office knew her values. What she hadn't done was let them touch her schedule. She'd kept them at the level of identity and never brought them down to Tuesday. That's where values either work or they don't. Not in the abstract, not in the statement. In the moment when something else is competing for the same hour. Values aren't what you believe. They're what you choose when believing isn't enough. Chapter 8. Uncertainty is not the enemy. Certainty is the delusion. A man spends 4 months researching which laptop to buy. He reads every review. He visits the subreddit. He makes a spreadsheet. He asks 3 people who know less than he does by this point. He finally buys one. 2 weeks later, he reads a review that suggests a different model might have been slightly better. He feels briefly but genuinely like he made a mistake. He did not make a mistake. He made a decision. These are not the same thing. The hunger for certainty before acting is one of the most expensive cognitive habits a person can have. Not because certainty is undesirable. Of course it's desirable. Of course it would be useful to know how things will turn out before you commit to them. But because certainty, in any meaningful decision, is not available. It is not a thing that exists in the category of choices that actually matter. And the pursuit of it doesn't reduce uncertainty. It just delays the moment you have to act inside it. Here is what the brain is actually doing when it demands more certainty before deciding. It is running a protection strategy that evolved for physical threats. In environments where your ancestors lived, hesitation in the face of genuine danger was adaptive. The animal that waited to confirm the threat before fleeing had worse survival odds than the one that fled immediately. Certainty seeking was useful. The problem is that the same system now applies to career decisions, relationship choices, and laptop purchases. The threat detection mechanism doesn't distinguish between a predator and an ambiguous opportunity. Both trigger the same demand: more information before I move. The result is that people wait for a signal that isn't coming. They stay in jobs they've outgrown because leaving feels uncertain. They delay starting things because the outcome isn't guaranteed. They research decisions until the decision makes itself, usually by default, usually in the direction of whatever required the least movement. The certainty never arrives. The waiting produces its own kind of outcome, just not the one anyone chose consciously. There's a concept in decision theory called the cost of delay. Every period of non-decision has a price, not just in lost opportunity, but in the compounding effect of remaining in a situation you've already decided isn't working. The discomfort of uncertainty feels immediate and real. The cost of delay feels abstract and future. So the brain chooses the concrete discomfort of waiting over the abstract cost of not moving. It is a coherent calculation. It is also frequently wrong. I once watched someone spend 11 months deciding whether to end a relationship that she'd privately concluded was over in month 2. The 9 additional months were not information gathering. They were certainty seeking. She already knew. She wanted to know without doubt, without risk, without the possibility of being wrong. That version of knowing doesn't exist. She eventually made the decision she'd made in month 2. The extra 9 months cost her 9 months. Working with uncertainty productively requires a specific reframe. The question is not how do I become certain before I act? That question has no answer. The question is, what is the cost of being wrong, and can I recover from it? Most decisions that feel enormous are, on honest examination, recoverable. Not painlessly, not without cost, but recoverable. The brain treats them as permanent and catastrophic because that's how threat detection is calibrated. Reality is usually more forgiving than the threat model suggests. Scenario planning is useful here, not as a way to predict the future, but as a way to demonstrate to yourself that you can survive multiple versions of it. You map the realistic best case, the realistic worst case, and the most likely case. Then you ask, honestly, whether you could navigate each one. The exercise doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It makes the uncertainty legible. It shows you that the unknown isn't an undifferentiated void of potential catastrophe. It's a range of outcomes, most of which you've handled versions of before. There's also something worth examining in the specific texture of certainty-seeking behavior. It rarely feels like fear. It feels like responsibility. It feels like due diligence. It feels like the reasonable behavior of someone who takes decisions seriously. This is part of what makes it so difficult to interrupt. The person who has read every laptop review doesn't feel paralyzed. They feel thorough. The distinction between thoroughness and avoidance is one of the more important ones to learn to make about yourself. A useful test. If additional information would actually change your decision, gather it. If additional information would make you feel better about a decision you've already effectively made, you're not researching, you're soothing. Both activities feel similar from the inside. They have very different relationships to the actual decision. The man with the laptop spreadsheet had made his decision by week 6. The remaining 10 weeks were not analysis. They were negotiation with uncertainty, an attempt to get the future to promise him something it categorically cannot promise anyone. Certainty is not the reward for thorough thinking. Clarity is. And clarity doesn't tell you what will happen. It tells you what matters and what you can live with. That's enough. It has always been enough. Move. Chapter 9. The feedback loop you're not running. A woman launches a small online business. The first 3 months are slow. She adjusts her pricing, changes her messaging, redesigns the website twice. Month 4 picks up. Month 5 is her best yet. She attributes the growth to the website redesign because that's the last thing she changed, and the timing feels connected. She has no actual data linking the redesign to the sales. She has a story that feels like data. 2 years later, she's redesigning the website again, wondering why growth has plateaued. The pricing structure, the thing that actually drove the month 4 recovery, hasn't been examined since. This is what a feedback loop looks like when it isn't really running. The information was there. The pattern was real. The interpretation attached the wrong cause to the right effect, and nobody caught it because nobody was looking systematically. They were looking the way humans naturally look, for confirmation, for narrative, for the most recent and visible explanation. A genuine feedback loop is not the same thing as paying attention. Paying attention is passive. You notice what's salient, what's recent, what fits the story you already have about what's happening. A feedback loop is active and structural. It asks specific questions at specific intervals and compares answers over time. It is, in short, a system, which is why most people don't run one. Systems require setup. Paying attention requires nothing except being present, which people are already doing anyway, and therefore assume is sufficient. It is not sufficient. The gap between what actually drives outcomes and what people believe drives outcomes is one of the more startling findings across behavioral and organizational psychology. People are genuinely poor at identifying cause and effect in their own lives, not because they're not intelligent, but because the conditions for accurate attribution are rarely present. The cause and the effect are often separated by time. Multiple variables change simultaneously. The outcome you're evaluating is partly determined by factors outside your awareness entirely. Under these conditions, the human brain defaults to narrative. It picks the most coherent story rather than the most accurate one. This means that without a deliberate feedback system, you are almost certainly learning the wrong lessons from your own experience. Not consistently, not catastrophically, but systematically enough that the accumulated effect over years is a set of beliefs about what works and what doesn't. That only partially corresponds to reality. Running a real feedback loop requires 4 things. First, you need a specific question. Not how is this going, but is this particular action producing this particular outcome? Vague questions produce vague answers that confirm whatever you already think. Second, you need a baseline. What did things look like before the change, so you have something to compare against? Third, you need a time window, a defined period after which you'll evaluate, rather than evaluating continuously based on whatever just happened. Continuous evaluation is just mood tracking. Fourth, you need honest accounting, which means including the data that contradicts your preferred explanation, not just the data that supports it. The honest accounting part is where most feedback loops quietly collapse. Not through deliberate dishonesty, through motivated reasoning, which is the brain's tendency to evaluate evidence more critically when it challenges preferred conclusions. You apply rigorous skepticism to information that suggests you were wrong and generous acceptance to information that suggests you were right. This is not a character flaw. It is a documented feature of human cognition that operates largely below conscious awareness. The only reliable defense against it is structure, a pre-committed framework for evaluating outcomes that you set up before you know what the results are. I kept a record once of decisions I'd made and their actual outcomes over a 12-month period. The results were instructive in a specific, uncomfortable way. Several things I'd been confident about were producing nothing. Several things I'd considered secondary were producing most of the results. The experience of running the business had felt informative. The actual information it had provided, unexamined, had mostly reinforced what I'd already believed going in. There's a related problem with how people handle negative outcomes. When something goes wrong, the review is immediate, thorough, and emotionally activated. The failure gets examined from multiple angles. Lessons are extracted. Adjustments are made. When something goes right, the review is brief, often non-existent, and emotionally satisfied. The success gets attributed, celebrated, and moved past. This asymmetry means people learn significantly more from failure than from success, which sounds reasonable until you realize it means your mental model of what works is built almost entirely from what didn't work. You know a lot about how not to do things. You know surprisingly little about the precise mechanism by which your best outcomes were produced. Deliberate post-success review is one of the most underused thinking tools available. When something works, the useful question is not great. What's next? It's what specifically caused this, and how do I replicate the conditions? Answered carefully. This builds a model of effectiveness that's grounded in actual evidence rather than intuition and attribution error. The feedback loop you're not running is the difference between experience and expertise. Everyone accumulates experience. It accrues automatically, simply by living and doing. Expertise requires something additional, the deliberate extraction of accurate lessons from that experience. Without the loop, 20 years of doing something produces 20 years of practice, some of it reinforcing effective patterns and some of it reinforcing errors, with no reliable way to tell which is which. The woman who redesigned her website twice wasn't failing to learn. She was learning constantly. She was just learning from the wrong signal, at the wrong level of analysis, without a system to catch the error. The data was always there. The loop just wasn't running. Build the loop first. Then trust what it tells you, especially when what it tells you is inconvenient. Chapter 10. The Architecture of Daily Clarity. A man has a system. Every morning, same time, same sequence. Coffee before the phone. 15 minutes of writing before email. One priority identified before the day begins. He's been doing it for 2 years. He doesn't find it inspiring. He doesn't look forward to it particularly. He does it the way he brushes his teeth, automatically, without requiring motivation, without needing to feel ready. His thinking is noticeably clearer than it was 2 years ago. He attributes this to the writing, or the coffee, or the priority setting. It's actually the structure itself. The specific activities matter less than the fact that they happen consistently, in sequence, before the day begins, accumulating entropy. Most people approach mental clarity the way they approach cleaning, reactively. They wait until things feel sufficiently chaotic, then they attempt a reset. Meditation retreat, digital detox, long walk, journal binge. These interventions are real and sometimes useful, but they're managing the symptom rather than the condition. Clarity that requires periodic dramatic intervention to restore is not clarity as a baseline. It's clarity as recovery. The architecture of daily clarity is not about peak experiences. It's about floor level, the minimum cognitive quality available on an ordinary day, under ordinary pressure, without special conditions. Most people have a floor that's lower than it needs to be because they've never built anything structural to keep it up. They rely on good days, good sleep, good circumstances. When those are absent, the floor drops and they make worse decisions, and they know it, but don't have a mechanism to prevent it. Structure is that mechanism. Not inspiration, not motivation, not the feeling of being ready to think clearly. Structure works precisely because it doesn't require any of those things. It works on Wednesdays in February, when nothing feels particularly meaningful, and the calendar is full, and you slept badly. That's when it matters most. That's also when motivation is least available. A system that only runs when you feel good is not a system. It's a hobby. The components of an effective daily clarity architecture are simpler than most people expect. A consistent starting point, the same small sequence every morning that signals to the brain that thinking time has begun. A defined window for the most cognitively demanding work, protected, not negotiable, placed when mental energy is highest. A midday pause of some kind, not a break from work, but a brief interruption of automatic processing, long enough to allow the prefrontal cortex to reset before the afternoon. An end-of-day review. 3 minutes, not 30, asking what happened, what needs to carry forward, and what can be released. That last element is consistently undervalued. The end-of-day review is what closes the open loops from the day before they migrate into tomorrow's mental background noise. Without it, the day's unresolved items, the email you didn't send, the decision you deferred, the conversation that landed strangely, persist in working memory overnight. They don't disappear during sleep. They percolate. They contribute to the vague sense of mental congestion that makes the following morning feel harder before it's begun. I went through a period of about 8 months where I ended every workday by simply stopping, closing the laptop, moving to the next thing, carrying the day's residue into the evening unexamined. The evenings felt fine. The mornings were consistently harder than they needed to be. The connection between the two took longer to identify than it should have. There's a concept in cognitive science called attentional residue. The finding that when you switch from one task to another without properly closing the first, part of your attention remains on the previous task. It doesn't follow you consciously. It follows you as a cognitive tax, a fraction of processing capacity that's still running in the background on what you left unfinished. The end-of-day review addresses this directly. It's a formal closing process, not for productivity, but for cognitive hygiene. The morning starting point serves a different function. It's not about output, it's about state. The first 30 minutes of the day have a disproportionate effect on cognitive tone, the ambient quality of attention and clarity that persists for hours afterward. Mornings spent in reactive mode, phone first, news first, email first, train the brain to begin each day in response rather than in direction. Over time, this becomes the default operating mode. You spend the day reacting with intermittent attempts to be proactive, rather than directing with interruptions you handle as they come. The difference in cognitive experience between these two modes is significant. The difference in outcomes, compounded over years, is enormous. What you protect in the morning is not time. It's orientation. The question of whose agenda governs the first hour of your thinking, yours or everyone else's, determines the quality of everything that follows. The middle of the day is where most clarity architectures fail to account for depletion. Decision fatigue is real. Cognitive load accumulates. By early afternoon, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, impulse regulation, and complex reasoning, is running on less than it was at 9 in the morning. This is not weakness. This is biology. The people who account for it structurally, who schedule their most demanding thinking before noon, who build in a genuine pause rather than pushing through, sustain better quality thinking across the full day. The people who ignore it make their worst decisions between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and often can't explain why. Clarity architecture is not a productivity system. It's not about getting more done. It's about ensuring that the decisions you make and the thinking you do happen under the best conditions your ordinary day can provide. Not the best conditions your best day can provide, but your ordinary day. Tuesday. With the bad sleep and the full calendar, and the 3 things that went sideways before noon, the man with the morning sequence isn't inspired every morning. He's just consistent every morning. Over 2 years, consistent has compounded into something that inspired never could have built. Build the architecture first, then show up to it. Even when you don't feel like it. Especially when you don't feel like it. The floor rises, slowly, reliably, without requiring you to feel anything about it. Chapter 11. The inner critic is not your conscience. A woman sits down to write. She types 2 sentences. A voice in her head observes that the sentences are obvious, that she's not the kind of person who writes well, that other people who attempt this kind of thing are generally more qualified, and that the whole project is probably a mistake. The voice speaks in complete sentences. It references her past. It sounds, if she's being honest, a lot like her 7th grade English teacher, who once returned a paper with the word mediocre written in red at the top. She closes the laptop. She tells herself she wasn't ready. The voice takes this as confirmation. The inner critic is one of the most consistently misunderstood features of human psychology. People either believe it or they fight it. They either accept its assessments as accurate or they try to silence it through affirmation and positive self-talk. Both approaches fail for the same reason. They treat the inner critic as something it isn't. It isn't your conscience. It isn't a quality control mechanism. It isn't the honest part of you cutting through self-deception. It's a threat detection system running on outdated social data. Here's what the inner critic actually is, neurologically and developmentally. Early in life, your brain learned that certain behaviors, falling short of expectations, drawing negative attention, failing to meet standards set by the people who controlled your safety and belonging, carried social risk. The brain, which is above all else a survival organ, developed an internal monitoring system to catch those behaviors before they occurred, to flag potential threat before the external response arrived. The inner critic is that system. It developed to protect you. It was, in the context where it formed, probably useful. The problem is that it's still running the same threat model it developed when you were 9. It hasn't updated. It doesn't have access to your current context, your current competence, your current situation. It has access to the emotional logic of your childhood's social environment. It applies that logic to everything. The 2 sentences you typed, the meeting where you spoke up, the relationship where you asked for something. It fires with the same authority, regardless of whether the threat is real, whether the assessment is accurate, or whether the advice it's implying would actually help. This is why the inner critic sounds so convincing. It doesn't sound like fear. Fear sounds reactive, impulsive, obviously emotional. The inner critic sounds measured. It sounds like reasoning. It cites specific failures. It makes comparative arguments. It structures its case. It is, in the most precise sense of the term, a very good lawyer for a very old case that no longer applies. The distinction between the inner critic and genuine self-assessment is one of the more important ones to learn to make. Because genuine self-assessment is valuable and should be listened to. The inner critic is not the same thing. Genuine self-assessment is specific, proportional, and oriented toward improvement. It says this particular section of the writing isn't working, and here's why. The inner critic is global, disproportionate, and oriented towards stopping. It says, "You are not the kind of person who does this well." One is feedback about work. The other is a verdict about identity. I've noticed, and this took longer to recognize than it should have, that my inner critic is loudest immediately before I do something that matters. Not during the easy work. Not during the tasks that are well within my established competence. Right at the edge of something new or significant. The timing, once you notice it, is clarifying. The critic activates when the stakes are real, which means it's responding to importance, not to actual inadequacy. The voice is loudest when the thing is most worth doing. This pattern is common enough to be diagnostic. If you're hearing the critic most intensely on the projects and decisions you care about most, what you're experiencing is not a reasonable assessment of your limitations. You're experiencing the threat detection system responding to high stakes. The feeling of inadequacy and the reality of inadequacy are not the same thing. They often peak together, but they peak together because importance triggers both genuine challenge and the critic's alarm. Working with the inner critic requires neither belief nor battle. Arguing with it doesn't help. The critic is not interested in evidence, and engaging with its logic keeps you in conversation with it when the better move is to return to the work. Suppressing it doesn't help. The suppression requires cognitive energy, and the critic resurfaces under pressure anyway, often louder for having been held down. What works is something closer to acknowledgement without compliance. You hear it, you recognize what it is, a threat detection system, not an oracle. You note that it's firing, which tells you something real about the stakes involved, and then you continue. Not because you've silenced it, because you've correctly identified it as a feature of the situation rather than an accurate assessment of your capacity. The woman who closed the laptop wasn't protecting herself from bad writing. She was obeying a system that formed before she understood what it was. The 2 sentences she typed might have been the beginning of something. The critic got there first, and she believed it. Not because it was right, but because it sounded right. It usually does. That's the whole trick. It sounds like your conscience. It speaks in your voice. It knows your history. It has been with you so long that distinguishing it from your own honest judgment requires more self-awareness than most people have ever been asked to develop. But it's not your conscience. Your conscience asks, "Is this right?" The critic asks, "Who do you think you are?" These are different questions. One is worth answering. Chapter 12. Complexity is usually optional. A team of 8 people spends 3 hours in a meeting discussing a problem that one person in the room understood clearly 40 minutes in. That person said something early on a direct, simple observation that identified the issue and implied the solution. The group didn't register it. They kept talking. They built frameworks. They drew a diagram. They identified stakeholders. They scheduled a follow-up meeting to discuss the output of this meeting. The person who understood the problem at minute 40 sits quietly, unsure whether to say it again more loudly or wait to be asked. She waits. Nobody asks. The follow-up meeting happens the following Thursday. This is not a story about inefficient meetings, though it is also that. It's a story about what complexity does in groups and in individual minds that simplicity cannot. It signals seriousness. It signals effort. It signals that the problem has been taken with the gravity it deserves. A simple answer to a complicated problem feels, emotionally, like the problem wasn't fully respected. So the complicated answer gets generated regardless of whether the complicated answer is better. Often it isn't. The human preference for complexity over simplicity has deep roots. In social contexts, simple answers can read as dismissive, as insufficient engagement with the difficulty of the situation. In intellectual contexts, complexity signals intelligence. The person with the elaborate framework appears to understand more than the person with the plain statement. In professional contexts, complex solutions are harder to challenge because the challenge itself requires engaging with the complexity. Simple solutions are exposed on all sides. There's nowhere to hide inside a one-sentence answer. None of this has anything to do with whether the simple answer is correct. Psychologists have a term for the bias toward complicated explanations. It relates to what's sometimes called the effort heuristic, the tendency to equate effort invested with quality of output. We assume that something that took longer, involved more steps, required more explanation, must be more valuable than something that arrived quickly and stated itself plainly. This is a reliable heuristic for evaluating physical labor. It is a frequently misleading heuristic for evaluating thinking. The best insight in a 3-hour meeting might have arrived in the first 15 minutes. It probably felt too simple to trust. Here's what's true about complex problems. They are genuinely complex. The variables are real. The interdependencies are real. The difficulty is not imagined. But complexity in the problem doesn't require complexity in the solution. In fact, solutions that match the complexity of the problem are often just restatements of the problem in more elaborate form. The solution needs to cut through the complexity, not reflect it back at you. The clearest thinkers I've encountered share a specific habit. Before engaging with any problem at full complexity, they ask what the simplest true statement about the situation is. Not the oversimplification, not the reduction that loses essential information. The simplest statement that remains accurate. This question forces a kind of cognitive editing. It requires you to identify what's essential and release what's elaboration. The elaboration often turns out to be most of it. There's a related pattern in how people approach decisions they're anxious about. The anxiety generates complexity. When you're uncertain about a choice, your mind produces more considerations, more variables, more possible angles. Not because the decision actually requires all of them, but because the brain, in anxious states, experiences more information as more safety. If you've thought about enough things, surely you've thought about the right thing. This is a cognitive illusion. Anxiety-generated complexity is not the same as genuine complexity. It's noise that wears the costume of thoroughness. I once spent the better part of a week analyzing a decision from angles that I was generating, primarily because I was afraid to land on an answer. The actual decision, stripped of the anxiety-generated complexity, required considering 3 things. I had been considering 14. The additional 11 were not protecting me from a bad decision. They were protecting me from having to make one. Cutting through unnecessary complexity requires a kind of intellectual courage that's different from the courage of bold action. It's the courage to say the obvious thing in a room that's invested in non-obvious answers. To name the simple truth when the situation has generated elaborate scaffolding around it. To trust a clear answer that arrived early rather than assuming that because it came easily, it must have missed something. The Occam's razor principle, that among competing explanations, the simpler one is more likely to be correct, is regularly cited and rarely practiced. In real situations, with real stakes and real social dynamics around intellectual credibility, simple answers feel risky. They don't feel like serious engagement. They don't look like work. They're frequently right anyway. There's a diagnostic question worth applying to any situation that has become very complex very quickly. Is this complexity load-bearing or is it decorative? Load-bearing complexity is complexity that, if removed, changes the answer. Decorative complexity is complexity that, if removed, simplifies the answer without changing it. Most complexity is decorative. It arrived not because the problem required it, but because the people thinking about the problem needed it to feel thorough, to demonstrate effort, to avoid the social exposure of a plain answer. The woman in the meeting who understood the problem at minute 40 wasn't wrong to hesitate. The room wasn't ready for the simple answer. The room needed to generate sufficient complexity first to feel that the problem had been properly respected. She knew this, which is why she waited. She was right about the problem. She was also right about the room. Sometimes the most precise thinking is knowing which one to address first. Chapter 13. The long game your brain doesn't want to play. A man in his early 40s looks back at a decision he made at 32 and understands it, finally, with complete clarity. He can see exactly what he was optimizing for. Relief. Not the best outcome. Not the outcome most aligned with what he actually wanted. The outcome that would end the discomfort of the moment fastest. He dressed it up at the time in the language of practicality, of being realistic, of not being naive. But stripped of the language, it was simple. He chose the option that would make him feel better by Thursday. He is not unusual. He is exactly what the brain produces when left to its own preferences. The human brain was not designed for long-term thinking. This is not a moral failing or a cultural problem or a symptom of modernity. It is biology. The brain's reward system is calibrated for immediate feedback. The dopamine response that reinforces behavior fires close to the action, not years after the consequence. Delayed gratification requires the prefrontal cortex to override the limbic system's preference for now. This override is possible. It is not the brain's default. The default is Thursday. The research on temporal discounting, the way the brain systematically undervalues future rewards relative to present ones, shows a consistent pattern across cultures, across age groups, across levels of education and intelligence. Given a choice between something good now and something better later, the brain reliably tilts toward now. The tilt is not proportional to how much better the future reward is. It's proportional to how distant it feels. A future that's abstract and distant gets dramatically less decision-making weight than a present that's concrete and immediate, even when the math strongly favors the future. This is the mechanism behind most decisions people regret. Not stupidity, not weakness. A brain doing accurate optimization for the wrong time horizon. The practical consequences are everywhere. The diet that works in theory, but not on Friday evening. The savings plan that makes sense in the abstract, but loses to the immediate purchase. The creative project that gets deferred in favor of what's comfortable and known. The difficult conversation that keeps not happening because the discomfort of having it is present tense, and the benefit of having had it is future tense. The brain registers these accurately. It's not miscalculating. It's calculating for the wrong window. What makes this particularly difficult to work with is that present tense decisions don't feel short-term in the moment. They feel like decisions. The justifications are available immediately, fully formed, persuasive. You don't experience yourself as choosing Thursday over the next decade. You experience yourself as being practical, realistic, flexible, or kind to yourself. The language of the rationalization is future-oriented, even when the actual motivation is immediate. The brain is very good at producing reasons. It is considerably less reliable about whether those reasons are the actual reasons. There's a technique that behavioral economists call the pre-mortem. Imagining yourself in the future, looking back at a decision that went wrong, and identifying in advance the reasons it failed. It's useful because it forces the brain into the future perspective it tends to avoid, and because it does so before the decision is made rather than after. The question isn't, how might this go wrong? It's 2 years from now, and this didn't work. Why didn't it work? The shift from hypothetical to retrospective produces different answers. The brain engages more concretely with failure when it's imagined as already having happened. The inverse is equally useful. Imagining yourself 10 years forward, looking back at the version of you making this decision right now, and asking what that person would think. Not in a vague, aspirational sense. Specifically, what would the 10-year version of you wish the current you had prioritized? What would they consider a waste? What would they consider an investment that compounded? The future self is a real cognitive entity that the brain can engage with, and research suggests that people who think concretely about their future selves make meaningfully different decisions than those who treat the future as abstract. I made a choice in my mid-30s to stop pursuing a particular kind of work because the immediate path was easier and the discomfort of continuing felt disproportionate to the uncertain return. It was a rational decision for Thursday. I understood within 18 months that I'd been optimizing for relief, not for outcome. The work I stopped pursuing turned out to matter more than I'd admitted. By the time that was clear, the momentum had dissipated, and rebuilding it cost more than continuing would have. The brain got what it wanted. I paid for it later. The long game requires specific structural supports because the brain won't play it voluntarily. Written commitments outperform mental ones. The act of writing something down makes it more concrete to the brain, more like a present tense reality than an abstract future intention. Accountability systems work not because external pressure is morally superior to internal motivation, but because they make future consequences feel present. When someone is expecting an update on Thursday, Thursday becomes now. The distant gets converted into the immediate, which is the only register the limbic system reliably responds to. Values function as long-game infrastructure when they're specific enough to apply to present decisions. The person who has concretely defined what they're building over a decade has a different experience of today's choices than the person for whom the future is a general preference for things being better. The specific future applies pressure to the present decision. The vague future doesn't. There's also something worth accepting about the nature of this work. Playing the long game doesn't feel like playing the long game. It feels like making boring decisions with no immediate payoff in a present that's offering easier alternatives. There's no sensation of wisdom in the moment. The reward is always out ahead, compounding quietly, invisible until it isn't. The man at 40 looking back at 32 wasn't stupid at 32. He was human at 32. The brain gave him what it was designed to give. Relief quickly, dressed in reasonable language. The long game asks for something the brain doesn't naturally offer, which is exactly why so few people play it, and why the ones who do end up somewhere different. It doesn't feel like anything while it's working. That's the whole secret, and also the whole difficulty. Chapter 14. The thinking error you're most proud of. A man at a dinner party describes himself as a skeptic. He says it with quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who believes they've earned an identity through intellectual discipline. He doesn't believe things without evidence. He questions assumptions. He doesn't fall for the obvious traps. He is, in his own assessment, someone who thinks carefully. He has held the same 3 political opinions since he was 24. He has not updated a core belief about human nature in 11 years. Every piece of evidence he encounters gets evaluated through a framework he built before he had enough experience to build it well. He is not a skeptic. He is a man who is skeptical of everything except his own conclusions. This is confirmation bias at its most sophisticated. Not the crude version where people ignore evidence entirely, but the refined version where intelligent people process all the evidence and somehow always arrive at what they already believed. The intelligence doesn't protect against the bias. In many documented cases, it makes it worse. This is the chapter that requires the most honesty. Not about obvious errors, the impulsive decisions, the emotional reactions, the choices made under pressure that you already know were mistakes. Those are easy to own because they feel like departures from your real self. This chapter is about the thinking errors you've integrated into your identity, the ones that feel like strengths. Confirmation bias is the most well-documented cognitive error in the psychological literature. The brain, when evaluating information, does not function as a neutral processor. It functions as an advocate. It applies different standards of scrutiny to evidence depending on whether that evidence supports or challenges existing beliefs. Supportive evidence gets waved through. Challenging evidence gets subjected to rigorous questioning. Its source is doubted. Its methodology is scrutinized. Its relevance is contested. The result is that even people actively seeking accurate information tend to accumulate evidence that confirms what they already think, because they're unconsciously grading incoming information on a curve tilted toward confirmation. The sophistication of the bias scales with intelligence. A less analytical person might simply ignore contradictory information. A more analytical person constructs a detailed argument for why the contradictory information doesn't apply, why this case is different, why the study has methodological limitations, why the source has an agenda. The argument sounds like rigorous thinking. It is rigorous thinking in service of a predetermined conclusion. Rigorous thinking and accurate thinking are not the same thing, and the difference between them is one of the more humbling realizations available. There's a specific type of confirmation bias worth examining separately, what psychologists call the blind spot bias. The finding, replicated consistently, that people readily identify cognitive biases in others and systematically underestimate those same biases in themselves. When asked whether they are susceptible to confirmation bias, most people say yes, in principle, while simultaneously demonstrating it in practice. The acknowledgement of the bias in the abstract doesn't protect against it. If anything, it provides a false sense of immunity. You believe you're watching for it. which makes you less vigilant than someone who hasn't considered it at all. I spent years believing I was good at reading people, at correctly identifying character, motivation, and reliability relatively quickly. The belief was based on genuine evidence. I had made some accurate assessments. What I hadn't done was systematically track the assessments that were wrong. I remembered the correct reads with clarity and satisfaction. The incorrect reads I remembered as anomalies, exceptions, situations where there hadn't been enough information, cases where the person had been unusually deceptive. The scorecard I was keeping was selectively curated in my favor. The skill I believed I had was partly real and partly a product of asymmetric memory. The errors you're most proud of are the hardest to see because they're housed inside your strengths. The person who values directness uses it to avoid the emotional work of diplomacy. The person who values patience uses it to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. The person who values thoroughness uses it to delay decisions they're afraid to make. The strength is real. It's also the packaging that the avoidance ships in. These aren't contradictions. They coexist cleanly, which is exactly what makes them difficult to disentangle. Working with confirmation bias productively requires something that feels intellectually uncomfortable. Actively seeking the strongest version of the opposing argument, not to defeat it, but to genuinely test your position against it. Not the straw man version of the counter-argument that's easy to dismiss. The real version. The version made by the most intelligent person who disagrees with you, using the best evidence available to them. If your position can't survive contact with that version, your confidence in it is higher than your evidence warrants. This practice is called steel manning, the opposite of straw manning. It requires genuine intellectual effort because the brain resists it. The brain wants to generate the weakest version of the opposing view, because the weakest version is the easiest to reject, and rejection produces the satisfying feeling of having won. Steel manning produces a different feeling, often the uncomfortable feeling of partial uncertainty, of realizing your position is correct only under certain conditions, or that the question is more genuinely open than you'd been treating it. Partial uncertainty is not a failure of thinking. It is an accurate representation of most important questions. The people most confident in their views on complex topics are frequently the people who've thought about them least carefully, or most carefully in only one direction. There's a question worth applying periodically to your most settled beliefs. When did I last genuinely try to change my mind about this? Not encounter information that challenged it and successfully defend against it. Actually try, with real effort, to find the case for the other side compelling. If the answer is never or not recently, the belief may be well-founded or it may be calcified. The feeling of certainty doesn't help you tell the difference. The man at the dinner party who calls himself a skeptic is not wrong that skepticism is valuable. He's wrong about who he's applying it to. Real skepticism isn't directed outward at claims that challenge your worldview. It's directed inward at the conclusions you've stopped questioning. That's harder. It's also the only version that actually improves your thinking. The errors that cost you most aren't the ones you know about. They're the ones wearing your best qualities as a disguise. Look there, carefully, without the certainty that you'll like what you find. Chapter 15, What You Owe Your Future Self. A woman writes a letter to herself at 50. She is 31 when she writes it. She describes what she hopes to have built, not in terms of possessions or titles, but in terms of who she wants to be. Clear-headed, unafraid of difficulty, someone whose choices she can look back at without the particular wince that comes from knowing you knew better and chose comfort anyway. She seals the letter. She puts it somewhere she'll find it. She finds it at 38. She reads it in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning. She sits with it for a long time. Most of what she described at 31, she is not. Not because she failed. She didn't fail in any obvious sense. She worked hard, made reasonable choices, avoided catastrophes. But the person she described in the letter made decisions differently than she has been making them. That person factored in something she gradually stopped factoring in, somewhere between 31 and 38, without noticing the moment it dropped away. She factored in her future self. The relationship most people have with their future self is, psychologically speaking, closer to a relationship with a stranger than with themselves. Neuroscientific research, particularly work using fMRI to observe brain activation, has shown that when people think about their future self, the neural patterns more closely resemble thinking about an unfamiliar other person than thinking about their present self. The future self doesn't feel like you. It feels like someone else who will inherit the consequences of your decisions. Which is, in a very precise sense, exactly what it is. This neurological distance has direct behavioral consequences. You make decisions that you would never make for yourself right now, but that you're comfortable imposing on this stranger who lives in the future. You eat the thing you know will cost you tomorrow. You skip the thing you know builds toward next year. You defer the difficult conversation that future you will still have to have, except by then it will be harder. You are, without experiencing it as such, consistently making your future self's life more difficult in exchange for making your present self's life more comfortable. The accounting is almost never explicit. Nobody thinks, I am choosing my convenience now at the expense of my future well-being. The thought is more diffuse than that. A vague sense that future you will handle it, will be more ready, will have more energy or more courage or more time. Future you is always better resourced than present you. This is a cognitive fiction. Future you is present you, plus the accumulated consequences of every decision present you made. What you owe your future self is not a sacrifice. That's the wrong frame, and it's the frame that makes long-term thinking feel punishing. You don't owe your future self deprivation in exchange for later reward. What you owe is accurate accounting. The honest recognition that present decisions don't disappear, they compound. That what you build or don't build, practice or don't practice, address or avoid today becomes the material your future self works with. Some of that compounding is obvious. Financial decisions accumulate in ways people understand, even when they don't act on the understanding. Health decisions compound in ways that remain invisible for years and then become visible all at once. But the compounding that matters most for clear thinking is cognitive and emotional. It's the habits of mind that either sharpen or dull with use, the patterns of avoidance that either get addressed or deepen, the self-knowledge that either develops or stagnates. A mind that has spent years practicing clarity thinks more clearly. A mind that has spent years avoiding difficulty gets better at avoidance. Both compound. Neither announces itself while it's happening. There's a specific debt people accumulate to their future self that goes largely unexamined. The debt of deferred self-knowledge. The things you've been meaning to understand about yourself, the patterns you've noticed but not examined, the feedback you've received and set aside, the questions about what you actually want that you've postponed in favor of what's immediately required. This deferral feels reasonable in any given moment. Accumulated over years, it produces a future self who is older and less clear, who has more experience and less understanding of what that experience means. I have a particular version of this I'm still working on. A pattern I identified clearly enough to name it 30 and have engaged with partially and inconsistently since. I understand it better now than I did then. I understand it less well than I would if I'd engaged with it consistently. The partial engagement produced partial clarity. The future self I'm becoming is still carrying something the 30-year-old version of me could have addressed more directly. I don't say this as confession. I say it because this is what deferred self-knowledge actually looks like from the inside. Not dramatic avoidance, just ordinary postponement, accumulated. The practical question is not abstract. It's specific and present tense. What does your future self need you to do today? Not eventually. Not when you're more ready. Not after the current pressures ease. Today. What conversation keeps getting deferred? What pattern keeps getting noticed and set aside? What decision is aging poorly while you wait for better conditions? Better conditions are not coming. This is not pessimism. This is the consistent finding of everyone who has waited for them. The conditions that exist right now are the conditions your future self will later identify as the moment when action was still relatively easy. The future self has a clarity about the present that the present self doesn't have access to. Because the future self can see what the delay cost. Building an honest relationship with your future self requires making that self concrete. Not an abstraction. Not a vague hope for things being better. A specific person with specific needs, living with the specific consequences of what you do and don't do today. The more concrete that person becomes, the more present tense weight their interests carry. The woman who wrote the letter at 31 understood something she later lost track of, not through failure, through the ordinary drift of a life that kept presenting immediate demands that felt more real than the abstract future she'd described. The letter wasn't a plan, it was a relationship, with a future version of herself that she'd taken seriously enough to address directly. At 38, reading it in the kitchen, she didn't feel regret exactly. She felt the particular clarity of seeing the drift from outside it, of understanding what had accumulated without her permission. She got a new piece of paper. She wrote another letter. This time she didn't seal it. She put it somewhere she'd see it regularly, not as a reminder of who she wanted to be, as a reminder of who is already watching. There is a version of this book that ends with a list. 10 habits, 5 principles, 3 things to do before breakfast. That version would feel more complete. It would also be doing the thing this entire book argued against, handing you a framework in place of understanding, giving you something to follow so you don't have to think. So instead, this. You have been thinking since before you could speak. The brain has been running its patterns, generating its stories, optimizing for Thursday, filing its threat reports, building its inner critics, seeking certainty in situations that don't contain any. All of it has been happening automatically, continuously, largely without your awareness or consent. What this book offered was not a replacement for that process. You cannot replace it. The machinery is built in. What you can do, the only thing you can do, is develop enough awareness of the machinery to stop being entirely governed by it. To notice the story before you've committed to it. To catch the certainty seeking before it becomes paralysis. To recognize the inner critic's voice as a voice rather than a verdict. To see the confirmation bias operating inside your proudest intellectual habits. To feel the pull toward Thursday and name it for what it is. That noticing is the whole game. It doesn't feel like a superpower. Superpowers feel like something. This feels like a pause, a small gap between the stimulus and the story. A moment of recognition that is easy to miss, and once you start catching it, impossible to fully unsee. The space between what happens and what you tell yourself about what happened. That's where everything in this book lives. Not in the frameworks, not in the principles. In that gap, which is present in every moment, available in every decision, accessible without equipment or optimal conditions or the right emotional state. Just a pause. Just enough distance to ask whether the story your brain just generated is accurate or just fast. Mental clarity is not a destination with an arrival date. It's not a credential you earn through sufficient self-improvement. It's a practice that looks from the inside, like making slightly better decisions slightly more often. Not because you've transcended the brain's tendencies, but because you've learned to work with them rather than simply being operated by them. The chapters you read described real patterns. Confirmation bias dressed in intellectual identity. The inner critic speaking in your voice about your history. The future self treated as a stranger who inherits your convenience. Complexity generated by anxiety and mistaken for rigor. Certainty sought in decisions that don't contain it. Feedback loops not running while experience accumulates without becoming wisdom. These patterns are not flaws to be eliminated. They are features of human cognition. Ancient, functional in their original context, frequently misapplied in this one. You don't fix them. You develop a working relationship with them. You learn their signatures. You catch them earlier. You build environments and structures and habits that make their influence smaller without requiring you to be a different kind of organism than you are. There will be days when none of this works. When the story takes hold before you catch it. When the inner critic lands and you believe it. When the comfortable Thursday choice wins cleanly over the difficult long-term one. When the feedback loop you built gets abandoned for 3 weeks, and the confirmation bias runs unchecked, and the future self gets deprioritized again in favor of what's pressing right now. Those days are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of being human, which was never in question. The practice returns, not because you're inspired to return to it. Inspiration is unreliable, and you know that now. Because you've built enough structure around it, that returning is what comes next. The architecture holds when the motivation doesn't. The routine runs when the feeling isn't there. The gap between stimulus and story stays available even on the days you forget to use it. What you owe yourself, present self, future self, the version of you reading this sentence right now, is not perfection of thought. It's honesty about the thinking. The willingness to look at how your mind actually works, rather than how you'd prefer it to work. The patience to build something slow and invisible that compounds into something real. The woman who wrote 2 letters. The man who finally understood his 32-year-old self at 40. The researcher who discovered her feedback loop was measuring the wrong thing. The person who heard the inner critic and continued anyway. None of them achieved clarity as a permanent state. They developed clarity as a recurring practice, imperfect, inconsistent, and over time, genuinely transformative. That's available to you, not as a promise, as a description of how this actually works for people who do the work. Think more clearly tomorrow than you did today. Not perfectly. Not without the brain doing what brains do. Just more clearly, more often, with slightly more awareness of the machinery running underneath. Over time, that's everything. Over time, that's the whole difference.